Today, I will be doing something a little different. I'm going to be reading a book, The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, the best way to listen to it would be, if you have YouTube Premium, you could just listen to it doing whatever you want, or you could just put it on a couple of headphones and just listen. However, how you like to listen to this is, your choice, but, let's see what happens. This is the first time I'm reading it, so I'll be reacting to everything like you are. So in the first third page, I just gotta preface this by saying that I played the game Call of Cthulhu. I really liked it, and I like how they said kept saying Cthulhu, Cthulhu. I really like that. So we know if you've played the game that someone named Algernon was the girl's friend. I forgot her name, Sally, Sam, something. Found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. Of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn from the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. Now we start with chapter 1, the horror in clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, such each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday the piercing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the singing glimpse of forbidden aeons, which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from it, an accidental piecing together of separate things. In this case, an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous itching. I think that the professor to intend to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926-27, with the death of my great-grand uncle George Gamble, Angel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island, which is not actually an island. Professor Angel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside which formed a short cut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but laterally, I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder, as my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from shooing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the queer clay bass field and the disjointed jauntings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle in his later years become credulous of the most superficial impostures, I resolved to search out the eccentric sculpture responsible for the apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bass relief was a rough rectangle less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which works in prehistoric writing. And writing of some kind, the bulk of these designs seemed certainly to be. Through my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even to hint at its remotest afflictions. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster or symbol representing a monster of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figures was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was aside from a jack of press cuttings in Professor Angel's most recent hand, made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dreamwork of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. Lagrassi, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AAS MTG dot manufacturing. I don't know what that means. Notes on same and Prof. Webb's account. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from philosophical books and magazines, notably by W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, and the rest comments on long surviving secret societies and hidden cults, which with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outer mental illnesses and outbreaks of group polyomania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angel bearing the singular clay bas relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family, slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur de Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius, but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention to the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the staid book of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit around the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested both an alienated sympathy, and my uncle skewed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kingship with anything but archaeologically. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic case which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding tear, or the contemplative sphinx, or garden girded Babylon." It was then that he began that rambling tale, which suddenly played upon his sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon returning, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters. Cthulhu Fataginin. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angel. He questioned the sculpture and with scientific minuteness and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas relief on which the youth had found himself working. Chilled and clad only in his night clothes, when waking had stolen bewildering over him. My uncle blamed his old age. Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphs and pictorial design, many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies. And Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical paganly religious body. When Professor Angel became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lure, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean list of dark and dripping stone with the subterranean why so intelligence shouting monotonously and enigmatically sense impacts unscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those written by the letter Cthulhu and Re. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries as course revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, rousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind apparently was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing miles high which walked on lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasionally frantic words as repeated by Dr. Toby convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. A reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home, and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Angel he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but references to certain of the scattered notes gave me such material for thought. So much, in fact, that only the ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of the dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secret secretary. His original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, nearing the traditional salt of the earth, give an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but harmless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes. In one case, there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes, as it was lacking their original letters. I have suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continue to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from aesthetics told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things. The intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported scenes and half sounds, not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreamers confessed acute fears of the gigantic nameless thing visible toward last. One case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a well-known architect with leanings toward theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escape denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. As well, it is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angel must have employed a cutting burrow, for the number of tracks was tremendous and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes and masks for some glorious fulfillment, which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mauled by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd, 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ardoué Bonnet hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926, and so numerous are the court troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, and I can at this stage scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I set them aside. But I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. I hope you like this. Chapter 2 will be tomorrow. Bye.